The year was 1452. In a small town called Vinci in Italy, something special happened. A baby boy was born who would change the world forever. There were no cars, no electric lights, and no computers. People traveled on horses or walked everywhere. Most people could not read or write. Life was hard for ordinary folks. But something wonderful was happening in Italy during this time. It was called the Renaissance. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. Nobody knew at that time that this tiny baby would grow up to become one of the most amazing people who ever lived. People were starting to ask questions about everything. They wanted to learn about art, science, and the world around them. Before this time, most people just accepted what they were told. Why do birds fly? Why does water flow downhill? Today, we might call someone who knows a lot about many things a Renaissance man. But Leonardo was the first real Renaissance man. He was not happy just learning about one thing. He wanted to understand everything. Most people thought that art and science were completely different things. Artists painted pretty pictures. Scientists studied boring facts. But Leonardo saw that art and science were connected. His pages are full of drawings of eyes, hands, flowers, machines, and buildings. If you wanted to read his notes, you had to hold them up to a mirror or learn to read backwards. During his life, he created some of the most famous paintings in the world. His real masterpiece was his way of thinking. He showed people that they did not have to choose between being an artist or a scientist. They could be both. He proved that curiosity and creativity could work together to create amazing things. He reminds us that the world is full of wonderful mysteries waiting to be discovered. He teaches us that it is okay to be curious about everything and to try many different things. He lived at a time when the world was changing and people were learning to think in new ways. But more than anyone else, he showed what was possible when a person decided to explore every corner of human knowledge and creativity. The Mona Lisa, with her mysterious smile, is probably the most famous painting ever made. The Last Supper shows Jesus eating with his friends and is painted on a wall in Italy where people still come to see it today. Nobody knows exactly why he did this. Maybe it was because he was left-handed and it was easier for him. Maybe he wanted to keep his ideas secret. Or maybe he just liked being different. Scientists look at his inventions and are amazed by his ideas. Engineers use his designs to build new machines. Writers tell stories about his adventures. He drew plans for helicopters, tanks, and submarines. He made maps of the human heart. He designed costumes for plays and planned huge parties for kings and princes. But Leonardo's life shows us a different way. He believed that everything in the world is connected. Art connects to science. Science connects to engineering. Engineering connects back to art. Understanding one thing helps us understand everything else. To paint a bird, he needed to understand how birds actually worked. To design a machine, he needed to make it beautiful as well as useful. Why do people look different from each other? His mind was always working, always thinking, always wondering. People were used to keeping different subjects separate. But Leonardo mixed everything together. When he painted a person's face, he studied the muscles underneath the skin. When he designed a building, he looked at how plants grew for ideas. When he watched water move, he thought about how to paint it in his pictures. But during the Renaissance, people began to think for themselves. Italy in those days was a very different place from today. He was also a scientist who studied the human body. He was an inventor who designed flying machines hundreds of years before airplanes were actually built. He was an engineer who planned bridges and canals. He was a musician, a writer, and a teacher. There seemed to be nothing that Leonardo could not do. The word Renaissance means rebirth. It was like the whole world was waking up from a long sleep. Leonardo was born right in the middle of this exciting time. He came into a world where new ideas were blooming like flowers in spring. He could draw better than most adults when he was still a young boy. His drawings looked so real that people thought they might come to life, but drawing was just one of his many gifts. Artists were painting in new ways. Scientists were making discoveries. Inventors were creating amazing machines. It was the perfect time for someone like Leonardo to be born. But Leonardo was not just any ordinary person. Even as a child, he was different from other kids. He was curious about everything he saw. When other children were playing simple games, Leonardo was watching birds fly and wondering how they stayed up in the air. When other kids saw a flower, they might pick it and throw it away. But Leonardo would sit and study it for hours, looking at every tiny detail. Leonardo had a special gift. He could see things that other people missed. He could look at a leaf and notice the tiny lines that ran through it. He could watch water flowing in a stream and see patterns that nobody else saw. This special way of seeing would make him famous all over the world. As Leonardo grew up, people began to notice his amazing talents. Leonardo was also very good at asking questions. While other people accepted things as they were, Leonardo always wanted to know why. This curiosity would lead Leonardo to study many different subjects. Leonardo became a painter, but he was much more than that. What made Leonardo so special was the way he combined different types of learning. This way of thinking was very new in Leonardo's time. Leonardo's notebooks show us how his mind worked. He wrote down everything he was thinking about. But Leonardo had one strange habit. He wrote everything backwards, like in a mirror. Leonardo lived for 67 years, which was a very long time in those days. But Leonardo's paintings were just a small part of what he did. Leonardo da Vinci died more than 500 years ago, but people still talk about him today. Students study his paintings in art classes. Leonardo shows us what a human being can accomplish when they never stop learning and never stop asking questions. In our modern world, people often think they have to choose just one thing to study or one job to do. This is why Leonardo da Vinci is called the ultimate Renaissance man. Leonardo da Vinci's story began with a secret that would shape his entire life. On that spring day in April 1452, when he was born in the small town of Vinci, he came into the world as an illegitimate child. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a successful and wealthy notary who helped people with legal papers. Society looked down on children who had unmarried parents. These children were called bastards, and they faced many difficulties in life. They could not inherit their father's property easily. They could not follow in their father's profession. They could not go to the best schools or get the best jobs. His mother was Caterina, a young peasant woman who worked on the land. Leonardo's difficult start in life would actually help make him the amazing person he became. In those days, being born outside of marriage was a serious problem. There were streams running through the valleys and forests full of birds and animals. For a curious child like Leonardo, it was like living in a giant playground where every day brought new things to discover. But sometimes what seems like a curse can become a blessing, and study how they move their wings. He noticed that different birds flew in different ways. Some flapped their wings quickly, others soared without moving their wings at all. He drew pictures of what he saw and filled up pages with his observations. Some people think he did this to keep his ideas secret. Others believe he did it simply because it was easier for a left-handed person to write that way. Whatever the reason, it made his notebooks mysterious and special. When he drew a flower, he would carefully study each petal and leaf. He would look at where the flower grew and what kind of soil it liked. He would watch insects visiting the flower and wonder why they came. He would drop stones in water and watch the ripples spread out in circles. He would roll balls down hills and notice how they moved faster and faster. Everything he saw made him ask new questions. The boy's drawings were better than those of many adult artists. Ser Piero was a practical man who understood the value of talent. He realized that his illegitimate son might have gifts that could bring honor to the family name. In the family records, Antonio wrote that Leonardo was a child of remarkable beauty and unusual intelligence. Most people thought left-handed children should be forced to use their right hand. But nobody tried to change Leonardo. This was actually lucky for him. One of these people was Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most famous artists and teachers in the city. Verrocchio ran a workshop where young men came to learn painting, sculpture, and other arts. Being left-handed, he naturally wrote from right to left, which made his handwriting look like it was written backwards. His father decided to take some of the boy's drawings to Florence, the biggest and most important city in the region. Because he could not follow the usual path that other boys from good families followed, he had to find his own way. Because he could not simply memorize old books, he learned to observe and think for himself. His real education was about to begin. Because he felt different from others, he was not afraid to be different. The boy was only about 14 years old, but his work showed incredible skill and understanding. Verrocchio agreed to take Leonardo as his apprentice. This was a huge opportunity. Verrocchio's workshop was like a university for artists. Only the most talented young men were accepted there. Florence was full of artists, craftsmen, and wealthy people who appreciated beautiful things. It was the perfect place to show off Leonardo's work. Later in life, this would become one of his most famous habits. He wondered how the bird could fly when humans could not. He studied the shape of the wings and the way the bird moved its body. He even caught dead birds and looked inside them to see how their bones and muscles were arranged. He could draw anything he saw, and his drawings looked incredibly real. He drew the faces of people in the town, the animals in the fields, and the plants in the gardens. He would be living and working with other young artists who shared his interests. He would learn from one of the best masters in Italy. The boy, who had felt like an outsider in his own family, would find a new family among the artists and craftsmen of the city. The child who could not go to regular school would get an education that was far better than anything a normal school could provide. Most importantly, he would finally be in a place where his curiosity and talents were valued. His pictures were so good that people would stop and stare at them in amazement. He noticed that the boy was always asking questions and always drawing pictures of everything he saw. When Leonardo was very young, his mother Caterina married another man and moved away. This was common in those times. Leonardo went to live with his father Ser Piero and his new wife. His father was not a cruel man, but he was busy with his work and his new family. Leonardo often felt like an outsider in his own home. Ser Piero lived in a nice house in Vinci. The town was beautiful, surrounded by rolling hills covered with olive trees and grapevines. Leonardo's grandfather Antonio was different from his father. The old man saw something special in the boy. While other children his age were learning to read Latin in school, Leonardo was learning from nature itself. He could not go to the formal schools because of his birth status. Regular schools taught children to memorize old books written by ancient writers. But Leonardo learned by watching, touching, and experimenting with the world around him. He spent hours watching birds fly through the sky. He would lie on his back in the grass. Leonardo was left-handed, which was considered unlucky in those days. The boy had another strange habit. He wrote in mirror writing, which meant his words could only be read easily if you held them up to a mirror. As Leonardo grew older, his artistic talents became impossible to ignore. But Leonardo was not just interested in making pretty pictures. He wanted to understand how things worked. When Leonardo saw a bird, he did not just draw its feathers. This curiosity made Leonardo very different from other children. While they played simple games, he was conducting his own experiments. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, began to notice his son's unusual talents. Around this time, Leonardo's life took an important turn. In Florence, Ser Piero knew many important people because of his legal work. When Verrocchio saw Leonardo's drawings, he was amazed. For Leonardo, this meant leaving his home in Vinci and moving to the big city of Florence. It was scary, but also exciting. The move to Florence would change Leonardo's life completely. Looking back, we can see that Leonardo's difficult childhood actually prepared him for his amazing future. The illegitimate son from the small town of Vinci was about to become one of the greatest apprentices in the history of art. When 14-year-old Leonardo walked through the gates of Florence for the first time, his eyes grew wide with wonder. The city was like nothing he had ever seen before. The streets were full of people from all over the world. Merchants sold silk and spices from faraway lands. Artists carried paintings and sculptures to wealthy customers. Rich families like the Medici spent huge amounts of money on art and beautiful buildings. They believed that surrounding themselves with beauty would make their city the greatest in the world. Because of this, Florence attracted the best artists, writers, and thinkers from all over Italy. The air buzzed with excitement and creativity. He mixed oils and varnishes. He prepared wooden panels and stretched canvas for paintings. This might sound boring, but Leonardo found it fascinating. Leonardo spent hours drawing people's faces, hands, and bodies. He also went out into the streets of Florence to sketch the people he saw there. People who saw his work could not believe that such a young person could draw so well. He wanted to understand exactly how each material worked and why. In Verrocchio's workshop, he also learned sculpture, metalworking, and engineering. Renaissance artists were expected to be able to make many different kinds of things. They might be asked to design a building, create a statue, paint a portrait, or even plan a party for a wealthy patron. Florence in the 1460s was the heart of the Renaissance. But they were also sometimes frustrated with him. Leonardo had a habit of starting many projects but not always finishing them. He would begin a drawing or sculpture, work on it intensively for days, and then suddenly lose interest and start something else. Once he understood how to solve a problem, he often became more interested in the next challenge than in finishing the work at hand. This would be a pattern throughout his entire life. Verrocchio was painting this religious scene for a church, and he asked some of his students to help him. Leonardo was given the task of painting one of the angels in the picture. This story might not be completely true, but it shows how people felt about Leonardo's incredible talent. This meant he was no longer just a student. He was recognized as a master artist who could set up his own workshop and take on his own apprentices. He continued to work there for several more years, learning everything he could. During this time, he began to develop his own style of painting that was different from his teacher's. Leonardo had used techniques that were more advanced than anything his teacher knew. The angel's face glowed with an inner light, and its expression was filled with gentle emotion. On one page, he might draw the anatomy of a flower. On the next page, he might design a new type of military weapon. Then he might write about the best way to paint hair or the movement of clouds across the sky. He was 26 years old and had spent more than 10 years learning his craft. But in many ways, his real education was just beginning. He studied how the human eye sees things and how the brain interprets what it sees. This painting was supposed to show the wise men from the East coming to worship the baby Jesus. It was an important job that could make Leonardo's reputation as an independent artist. He realized that painting was not just about copying what you see, but about understanding how vision itself works. In these books, he wrote down his observations and drew sketches of everything that interested him. He became fascinated with technical problems and spent more time experimenting than actually painting. After working on the project for several years, Leonardo suddenly abandoned it and left Florence for Milan. He experimented with new painting techniques and spent months planning the composition. But as often happened with Leonardo, his perfectionist nature worked against him. Even though Leonardo never completed it, the painting shows his revolutionary approach to composition and his deep understanding of human emotion. He wrote about the flight of birds, the flow of water, the expressions on people's faces, and hundreds of other subjects. While they were content to master the traditional techniques of painting and sculpture, Leonardo was trying to understand the fundamental principles behind everything he saw. He was becoming not just an artist, but a scientist and inventor as well. When he learned to carve marble, he studied the tools and thought about ways to improve them. But each unfinished work taught him something new and helped him develop the skills that would make him the greatest artist of his time. When he learned to cast bronze, he experimented with different mixtures of metals. When he worked with wood, he examined the grain and thought about why some pieces were stronger than others. He became like a father to the young man. Verrocchio saw that Leonardo was different from his other students. Most apprentices were happy to learn one skill well. They wanted to become good painters or sculptors and make a living from their art, but Leonardo wanted to learn everything. Leonardo's new home was Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop. The workshop was a busy, noisy place that never seemed to sleep. During the day, apprentices hammered metal, mixed paint, and carved wood. Master craftsmen worked on paintings and sculptures for important customers. In the evening, everyone gathered to share meals and discuss their work. Verrocchio was not just Leonardo's teacher. In the workshop, Leonardo learned the traditional way that artists were trained. First, he spent months just preparing materials. He ground colored stones into powder to make paint. Next, Leonardo learned to draw. But he did not just copy pictures from books like most students. He drew from real life. Verrocchio brought live models into the workshop. Leonardo's drawings were amazing from the very beginning. While other students struggled to make their pictures look real, Leonardo's drawings seemed to breathe with life. But drawing was just the beginning of Leonardo's education. Leonardo loved this variety. His curious mind soaked up everything like a sponge. The other apprentices were amazed by Leonardo's ability to learn so quickly. This happened because Leonardo's mind was always racing ahead to new ideas. The most famous story from Leonardo's time in Verrocchio's workshop involves a painting called The Baptism of Christ. When Leonardo finished his angel, something remarkable happened. The angel he painted was so beautiful and lifelike that it made the rest of the painting look old-fashioned. Legend says that when Verrocchio saw what his student had done, he was so amazed and perhaps a little embarrassed that he put down his brushes and never painted again. By 1472, when Leonardo was 20 years old, he was accepted into the Guild of St. Luke, the organization for professional artists in Florence. But Leonardo was not ready to leave Verrocchio's workshop yet. Leonardo became fascinated with the way light falls on objects and creates shadows. He also began his famous habit of keeping detailed notebooks. Leonardo carried small books with him wherever he went. These notebooks reveal the incredible range of Leonardo's interests. Leonardo's fellow artists began to notice that he was not like them. In 1478, Leonardo finally felt ready to leave Verrocchio's workshop and start his own career. Leonardo's first independent commission was to paint a large altarpiece called The Adoration of the Magi for a monastery outside Florence. Leonardo approached this project with his usual intensity. He made dozens of preparatory drawings, studying every figure and detail. The more he worked on the painting, the more he saw ways to improve it. He kept changing and adjusting his plans. The unfinished Adoration of the Magi still exists today, and art experts consider it one of the most important works in the history of painting. This pattern of starting ambitious projects and then leaving them unfinished would continue throughout Leonardo's career. In 1482, when Leonardo was 30 years old, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He was tired of the competitive atmosphere in Florence, where artists constantly fought for the attention of wealthy patrons. He had heard stories about Milan, a powerful city in northern Italy ruled by the Sforza family. Milan was rich, ambitious, and looking for talented people to help make it even greater. This was a clever strategy. Many cities had good artists, but few had talented military engineers. Leonardo knew that Duke Ludovico was more interested in protecting his territory than in decorating his palace. Where Florence was a republic ruled by wealthy merchants, Milan was controlled by one powerful family. Duke Ludovico Sforza was called Il Maro, which meant the Dark One because of his dark complexion. Instead of having to compete with other artists for small commissions, he became the Duke's personal artist and engineer. He had access to unlimited resources and could work on projects as large and ambitious as he could imagine. Duke Ludovico wanted to honor his father Francesco Sforza with the largest equestrian monument ever created. The finished statue would have stood 24 feet tall and weighed more than 70 tons. He studied horses in incredible detail, measuring their proportions and observing how they moved. He dissected dead horses to understand their anatomy. He made countless drawings showing horses from every possible angle. His notebooks from this period are filled with sketches of horse heads, legs, and bodies. No one had ever attempted to cast such a huge bronze sculpture before. He was ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless. He wanted to make Milan the most powerful and beautiful city in Italy. Leonardo decided to write a letter to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. Duke Ludovico invited Leonardo to come to Milan and join his court. He created lifting machines that could move the heavy pieces of the mold. He even planned a special building where the casting would take place. The project became a showcase for Leonardo's skills as both an artist and an engineer. Leonardo packed up his belongings, including his precious notebooks, and traveled north to begin a new chapter of his life. The monks at the monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie asked him to paint a scene of the Last Supper on the wall of their dining hall. This was the story from the Bible where Jesus tells his 12 disciples that one of them will betray him. Leonardo had to solve enormous engineering problems. How do you create a mold large enough for such a massive statue? How do you heat enough bronze to fill it? More importantly, it established his reputation as someone who could tackle impossible challenges. He made sketches of hands in different positions. He studied how groups of people naturally arrange themselves when they sit together. Every detail of the painting was carefully planned. He wanted to show the exact instant when Jesus spoke those shocking words and each apostle reacted with surprise, fear, or anger. How do you prevent the metal from cooling unevenly and cracking? These challenges excited Leonardo's inventive mind. But this was not an ordinary letter asking for work as an artist. The painting combined perfect technical skill with deep psychological insight. It showed not just what the apostles looked like, but what they were thinking and feeling. Instead of using the traditional fresco technique, where paint is applied to wet plaster and must be finished quickly, Leonardo experimented with a new method. He painted on dry plaster using oil-based paints, which allowed him to work slowly and make changes. He studied the flight of birds and designed flying machines. He investigated the properties of light and water. He filled notebook after notebook with observations and inventions. Instead, Leonardo presented himself as a military engineer and inventor. He wrote that he could design bridges that could be built quickly during wars. Political storms were gathering that would soon sweep away the world he had known. Foreign armies were marching toward Italy, and the small Italian city-states would soon find themselves caught up in much larger conflicts. Duke Ludovico appreciated Leonardo's genius and was willing to support his experiments and investigations. He had learned to think on a grand scale and to tackle problems that no one had ever solved before. These skills would serve him well in the challenging years that lay ahead. He planned irrigation systems to bring water to farms around the city. He had proven that he could succeed as both an artist and an engineer. He had created works that would be remembered for centuries. The young man who had arrived in Milan as an unknown talent had become one of the most famous and respected people in the city. He drew maps and designed fortifications to protect Milan from enemy attacks. The clay model stood in the courtyard of the Sforza castle for years until French soldiers used it for target practice and destroyed it. The painting is filled with symbolic details that viewers are still discovering today. He could create covered vehicles that would protect soldiers in battle. Visitors came from all over Europe just to look at this incredible sculpture. The clay horse became one of the wonders of Milan. He could build cannons and other weapons that would make Milan's army unbeatable. Almost as an afterthought at the end of his letter, Leonardo mentioned that he could also paint and sculpt. The letter worked. Milan was very different from Florence. Leonardo found that life in a ducal court suited him perfectly. One of Leonardo's first major projects in Milan was designing a massive bronze horse statue. Leonardo threw himself into this project with his usual enthusiasm. But the horse project was about much more than just sculpture. He designed new types of furnaces that could melt huge amounts of bronze. Leonardo spent years working on the horse project. He created a full-size clay model that amazed everyone who saw it. But the bronze horse was never finished. Political problems and wars meant that all the bronze that had been collected for the statue was used to make cannons instead. Even though the horse was never completed, the project taught Leonardo enormous amounts about sculpture, engineering, and metallurgy. While working on the horse, Leonardo also received the commission that would create his most famous masterpiece. Most artists painted the Last Supper as a calm, peaceful scene. But Leonardo saw it as a moment of high drama and emotion. Leonardo spent months planning the painting. He walked the streets of Milan studying faces and expressions. The actual painting took Leonardo nearly 4 years to complete, from 1495 to 1498. This technique let Leonardo create incredibly subtle effects. Each apostle's face shows a different emotion. Their gestures and body language tell a story. When the Last Supper was finished, people recognized immediately that Leonardo had created something revolutionary. During his years in Milan, Leonardo also worked on many other projects. He designed costumes and sets for elaborate court entertainments. Leonardo also continued his scientific studies. He dissected human bodies to learn about anatomy. The court of Milan gave Leonardo something he had never had before, the freedom to pursue his interests without worrying about money. But Leonardo's comfortable life in Milan was not destined to last forever. For now, though, Leonardo was at the height of his powers. The Milanese years had transformed Leonardo from a promising artist into a true Renaissance master. In 1499, Leonardo's comfortable world in Milan came crashing down. French armies led by King Louis XII invaded northern Italy and captured the city. Duke Ludovico Sforza, who had been Leonardo's patron and protector for nearly 20 years, was forced to flee. Years of work were destroyed in a matter of hours. The massive sculpture that had amazed visitors from across Europe was reduced to broken pieces of clay scattered across the courtyard. The French soldiers marched through the streets of Milan, and everything changed overnight. He also took with him his students and assistants who had worked with him in Milan. Together, they left the captured city and began a new phase of Leonardo's life as a wandering genius. Venice was famous for its ships and its empire that stretched across the Mediterranean Sea. The Venetian government was worried about Turkish armies that might attack their territories, so they were interested in Leonardo's skills as a military engineer. Florence welcomed him back like a hero. He was now famous throughout Italy, and the city was proud to claim him as one of their own. Leonardo watched in horror as French archers used his beautiful clay horse model for target practice. The powerful Medici family had been driven out of the city. A strict monk named Savonarola had convinced many people that art and luxury were sinful. Although Savonarola himself had been executed, his influence still affected the city's atmosphere. At 47 years old, Leonardo suddenly found himself without a home, without a patron, and without the security he had enjoyed for so long. Instead of showing Lisa in a formal pose against a plain background, he placed her in front of a mysterious landscape with winding paths and distant mountains. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, and her eyes seemed to follow the viewer wherever they moved. A wealthy silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo asked Leonardo to paint a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. This woman would become known to the world as the Mona Lisa, but he was not completely helpless. His reputation as a brilliant artist and engineer had spread far beyond Milan. He had always been interested in how the human body worked, but now he decided to study anatomy seriously and systematically. He arranged to work with doctors and was allowed to dissect bodies of people who had died. He carried the painting with him wherever he traveled, never quite satisfied that it was finished. The portrait became his constant companion and his masterpiece. He wanted to understand exactly how human beings were put together. He dissected perhaps 30 bodies over the years, carefully drawing everything he saw. His anatomical drawings are some of the most accurate and beautiful ever created. Wealthy merchants and government officials competed to hire him. They wanted him to paint portraits of their families and create works of art that would show off their wealth and taste. Leonardo had to work in secret, often at night in cold rooms where the bodies were kept. The smell was terrible, and the work was difficult and sometimes frightening. The painting was supposed to show a famous Florentine victory at the Battle of Anghiari. Instead of using tried and tested painting techniques, he decided to experiment with new materials and methods. He mixed his paints with wax and tried to heat the wall to make the colors more vivid. They showed a new way of depicting action and emotion that was more realistic and powerful than anything that had been done before. The experiment was a disaster. The paint began to run and drip, ruining the work. The French and Spanish were fighting for control of different parts of the country. Cities formed alliances and then switched sides when it suited them. In this unstable environment, artists and intellectuals had to be careful about which rulers they served. He made hundreds of sketches showing the violence and chaos of battle. He had heard that Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, was looking for talented engineers to help with his military campaigns. Borgia was young, ambitious, and ruthless, but he was also intelligent and appreciated talent. For about a year, he traveled through central Italy with Borgia's army, designing fortifications and studying the landscape. He created some of his most accurate maps during this period, showing cities and territories with mathematical precision. Borgia was cruel and unpredictable, and many of the people around him ended up dead or in prison. Leonardo was relieved when Borgia's power collapsed and he could return to safer employment. His preparatory drawings showed horses rearing up, soldiers fighting desperately, and the dust and confusion of combat. Cities and rulers across Italy knew about his talents and wanted to hire him. Leonardo packed his most precious possessions, especially his notebooks filled with years of observations and inventions. He examined the eye and figured out how vision works. He looked at muscles and bones and understood how they work together to create movement. He was now 51 years old and at the height of his fame. His restless travels had taught him much about the world, and had given him experiences that enriched his art and his understanding. His notebooks became filled with incredibly detailed drawings of every part of the human body. First, Leonardo traveled to Venice, the wealthy trading city built on islands in a lagoon. Leonardo used a technique he had perfected called sfumato, which created soft, smoky shadows that blended colors together without harsh lines. This technique made Lisa's expression seem to change depending on how you looked at her. Sometimes she seemed to be smiling, sometimes she looked serious, and sometimes she appeared to be hiding a secret. In Venice, Leonardo designed new types of fortifications and weapons. He created plans for a mobile bridge that could be quickly assembled to help armies cross rivers. He even designed an early type of submarine that could sneak up on enemy ships underwater. The Venetians were impressed by his ideas, but they were too strange and advanced for them to actually build. After a few months in Venice, Leonardo decided to return to Florence, the city where he had first learned his trade. But Florence in 1500 was different from the Florence Leonardo had left as a young man. Despite these changes, Leonardo found plenty of work in Florence. During this second stay in Florence, Leonardo received the commission that would create his most famous painting. Leonardo approached this portrait differently from any he had painted before. But it was Lisa's smile that made the painting truly special. Leonardo worked on the Mona Lisa for years, constantly making tiny improvements and adjustments. While living in Florence, Leonardo also began the most ambitious scientific project of his career. This was dangerous and controversial work. Many people believed that cutting up dead bodies was sinful and should not be allowed. But Leonardo's curiosity was stronger than his fear or disgust. Leonardo studied the heart and discovered things about how blood flows that doctors would not understand for another 100 years. During this period, Leonardo also received another important commission. The government of Florence asked him to paint a huge battle scene on the wall of their council chamber. Leonardo was excited by this project because it gave him a chance to study horses and soldiers in action. But once again, Leonardo's experimental nature worked against him. Leonardo never finished the battle painting, but his preparatory drawings influenced other artists for generations. While Leonardo was working on these projects in Florence, political events were changing Italy once again. Leonardo decided that he needed a more secure situation. In 1502, Leonardo joined Cesare Borgia as his chief military engineer. But Leonardo soon realized that working for Cesare Borgia was dangerous. By 1503, Leonardo was back in Florence, once again working as an independent artist and inventor. Being a genius in the Renaissance was not as wonderful as it might seem. Leonardo da Vinci learned this lesson over and over again throughout his life. While other people saw him as incredibly talented and lucky, Leonardo often felt frustrated, lonely, and misunderstood. And move on to the next commission, Leonardo could never stop trying to make his work better. He would spend months or even years on a single painting, constantly adding tiny details and making small improvements. His amazing abilities came with problems that ordinary people never had to face. One of Leonardo's biggest challenges was his perfectionism. While most artists were happy to finish a painting, this perfectionism meant that Leonardo finished very few of his works. Patrons who hired him expected to receive completed paintings or sculptures within a reasonable time. But Leonardo would often become so absorbed in solving technical problems or experimenting with new techniques that he forgot about deadlines completely. In Renaissance society, a person's family background affected almost everything they could do. Leonardo could not inherit property easily, could not hold certain government positions, and was sometimes excluded from important social events. Leonardo's interests were so wide-ranging and his mind so advanced that he had trouble finding people who could understand him. While other artists talked about painting techniques or business matters, Leonardo wanted to discuss the flow of blood through the heart or the mathematics of perspective. The monks who commissioned the Last Supper grew increasingly frustrated as Leonardo took 4 years to complete what should have been a one-year project. He said that men of genius sometimes accomplish more when they appear to be working least, because their minds are inventing and forming perfect ideas. But most people did not understand this explanation. They thought Leonardo was lazy or unreliable. One page might contain drawings of flowers, military machines, and human skulls all mixed together. He became more secretive about his personal life and more careful about who he trusted. To Leonardo, these subjects were all connected, but other people could not see the connections. His mind conceived inventions and discoveries that were impossible to build or prove with the technology and materials available in the Renaissance. This created a constant sense of frustration. He created plans for submarines, but the materials needed to build them did not exist. He understood principles of flight that would not be rediscovered until the Wright brothers flew their airplane in 1903, more than 400 years after Leonardo's death. He saw that the brain controlled the body through a nervous system, when most people still believed that the heart was the center of thought and emotion. But he could not convince other medical professionals to accept his findings. He complains that people praise his artistic ability, but ignore his scientific discoveries. He worries that his ideas will die with him because no one else understands them well enough to continue his work. They complained to Duke Ludovico that Leonardo would sometimes stand in front of the painting for hours without picking up a brush, just thinking about what to do next. Other times he would rush into the monastery, make a few quick brushstrokes, and then leave again. In 1476, when Leonardo was 24 years old, he and several other young men were accused of inappropriate behavior with a male prostitute. When he wrote about his discoveries, he often phrased them in ways that would not offend church officials. But privately, his scientific observations led him to conclusions that were very different from what the church taught about the nature of the world. Leonardo cared deeply for these young men, but the relationships also set him apart from other artists who had wives and families. Around 1516, when he was 64 years old, he suffered a stroke that paralyzed his right hand. Since Leonardo was left-handed, he could still write and draw, but the stroke affected his overall health and energy. He understood that his gifts came with responsibilities and costs, but he never wished to be ordinary. His mind moved so quickly from one interest to another that he had trouble focusing on single projects for long periods. He would become intensely interested in studying water flow, filled dozens of pages with observations. He had always been proud of his physical strength and his keen eyesight. As these abilities diminished, he had to accept that there were limits to what even his remarkable mind could accomplish. His notebooks from his final years show that his curiosity remained as strong as ever. He continued to design new inventions, study natural phenomena, and think about the fundamental principles that governed the universe. But it also allowed him to make connections between different fields of knowledge that no one else could see. Leonardo understood that the same mathematical principles that governed the flow of water also applied to the movement of air around birds' wings and the circulation of blood through human bodies. And drawings, and then suddenly switched to investigating the flight of birds or the structure of tree branches. The wealthy merchants and nobles who might have hired him often chose other artists instead, even if those artists were less talented. They preferred to work with someone who would actually deliver a completed painting rather than risk hiring the great Leonardo and receiving nothing. Leonardo tried to explain that great art could not be rushed. His scientific investigations led him to question some traditional beliefs about how the world worked. His mirror writing and cryptic notes made some people think he might be practicing magic or heresy. This reputation for not finishing work followed Leonardo throughout his career. Leonardo's illegitimate birth continued to cause problems throughout his life. More painful was the loneliness that came from being different. Most people found Leonardo's notebooks fascinating but confusing. His mirror writing made them hard to read, and his ideas jumped from topic to topic in ways that seemed random. Leonardo's homosexuality also created difficulties for him. Although same-sex relationships were common in Renaissance Florence and were often tolerated, they were still officially illegal. The charges were eventually dropped, probably because one of the accused came from a powerful family. But the experience was humiliating and frightening for Leonardo. Throughout his life, Leonardo seemed to prefer the company of beautiful young men who became his students and assistants. These relationships were probably both romantic and professional. Perhaps the greatest burden Leonardo carried was being centuries ahead of his time. Leonardo designed helicopters, but there were no engines powerful enough to make them fly. His anatomical discoveries were similarly advanced. Leonardo figured out how the heart worked as a pump long before other doctors understood circulation. This isolation of genius created deep sadness in Leonardo. His notebooks contain passages where he writes about feeling misunderstood and alone. Leonardo also struggled with what we might today call attention deficit disorder. This mental restlessness contributed to his reputation for leaving works unfinished. Religious authorities sometimes viewed Leonardo's work with suspicion. His anatomical studies required him to cut up dead bodies, which many churchmen considered sinful. Leonardo had to be careful not to challenge religious teachings too directly. As Leonardo grew older, he also faced the universal challenge of declining physical abilities. The aging process was particularly difficult for someone like Leonardo, whose identity was so closely tied to his ability to create and discover. Despite all these challenges, Leonardo never stopped working and learning. The burdens of genius were real and heavy, but Leonardo carried them with dignity and determination. In 1513, Leonardo da Vinci packed his belongings once again and traveled to Rome, the eternal city that was the center of the Christian world. He was 61 years old, an age when most men of his time were thinking about retirement. But Leonardo's restless mind was still hungry for new experiences and challenges. Rome in the early 1500s was experiencing a golden age of art and culture. Pope Leo X, a member of the powerful Medici family, was spending enormous amounts of money to beautify the city and attract the greatest artists of the time. The Pope had hired Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and Raphael to decorate the papal apartments. Now he wanted Leonardo to join this incredible gathering of talent. Leonardo was given rooms in the Vatican where he could live and work. For the first time in years, he had a steady income and did not need to worry about finding new patrons. The Pope's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, became Leonardo's protector and provided him with assistance and materials for his projects. The other great artists working there, especially Michelangelo and Raphael, were much younger than he was and worked in very different ways. They wanted Leonardo to paint masterpieces that would glorify the church and the papal court. When Leonardo spent weeks designing a machine for making perfect circles instead of working on a commissioned painting, they became frustrated with him. He accused one of them, a German mirror maker, of stealing his ideas and revealing his secrets to other people. Leonardo had always been protective of his inventions and discoveries, and he became increasingly paranoid about people copying his work. He was already suffering from the effects of age, and the stress of trying to meet expectations that did not match his interests made him feel tired and discouraged. His notebooks from this period show less of the enthusiasm and energy that had characterized his earlier writing. He spent most of his time studying mathematics, investigating the properties of mirrors and lenses, and working on mechanical inventions. The French king was genuinely interested in learning and discovery, not just in owning beautiful objects. He had been impressed by Italian Renaissance culture during his military campaigns and wanted to bring some of that sophistication to France. He designed new types of machines for making coins and experimented with ways to drain the marshes around Rome. They focused intensively on their artistic commissions and completed them quickly and efficiently. After years of struggling with patrons who did not understand his scientific interests, the idea of having unlimited freedom to explore whatever he wanted was incredibly appealing. Despite his age and declining health, he decided to make one more journey to begin a new chapter of his life. Leonardo had to cross the Alps in winter, traveling on rough mountain roads in cold weather. He brought with him his most precious possessions, his notebooks filled with a lifetime of observations. The king gave him a beautiful manor house called Clos Luce in the Loire Valley, near the royal castle of Amboise. The house was connected to the royal castle by an underground tunnel, which allowed the king to visit Leonardo easily and frequently. Francis was intelligent, curious, and eager to learn about art, science, and engineering. The two men, despite the 42-year difference in their ages, became close friends. Without the pressure of commissions and deadlines, he could organize his thoughts and work on projects that truly interested him. He spent hours arranging his notebooks and trying to prepare them for publication. Leonardo enjoyed having someone who appreciated both his artistic achievements and his scientific investigations. He studied the movement of water in rivers and designed systems for controlling floods. He investigated the formation of clouds and the causes of wind. Leonardo designed elaborate entertainments for these visitors, creating mechanical lions that could walk and open their chests to reveal bouquets of flowers. These devices delighted the French courtiers and showed that, even in his old age, Leonardo had lost none of his ability to amaze and surprise people. He worked on problems of engineering and architecture, always pushing the boundaries of what was known and understood. And discoveries and 3 paintings including the Mona Lisa, which he had been carrying with him for more than 15 years. His curiosity about the world never diminished, and he continued to fill his notebooks with observations and ideas right up until his final days. And although he could still write and draw with his left hand, his overall strength was diminishing. He began to realize that his time was running out and that he would not be able to complete all the projects he had planned. But Leonardo soon discovered that Rome was not the perfect place for him that he had hoped it would be. King Francis I of France, who had recently conquered parts of northern Italy, sent an invitation to Leonardo. He worked intensively on organizing his legacy, trying to ensure that his discoveries and inventions would not be lost after his death. He spent long hours with his devoted student Francesco Melzi, explaining his notes and drawings and teaching him how to continue the work. The young king, who was only 22 years old, had heard about Leonardo's reputation and wanted to bring him to France. Now finally, he had the time and freedom to work on these projects. He began organizing his thousands of pages of notes and drawings into coherent treatises that other people could read and understand. The Pope and his advisors began to wonder if they had made a mistake in bringing Leonardo to Rome. Leonardo, with his habit of starting many projects and leaving them unfinished, seemed old-fashioned and unreliable compared to these energetic younger masters. Francis promised to provide Leonardo with a comfortable home, a generous pension, and all the materials he needed for his research. Leonardo tried to adapt to the Roman environment, but his interests had shifted away from painting toward scientific research and engineering projects. The Roman authorities were not particularly interested in these projects. Leonardo also encountered problems with some of his assistants in Rome. The tension and disappointment of his Roman years took a toll on Leonardo's health. In 1516, when Leonardo was 64 years old, an unexpected opportunity arrived that would change his life one final time. Francis I was very different from the Italian patrons Leonardo had served. The king offered Leonardo something that no patron had ever given him before: complete freedom to pursue whatever interested him, with no requirement to produce specific works of art. Leonardo was intrigued by this offer. The trip from Italy to France was long and difficult for an elderly man. Francis I welcomed Leonardo to France with great honor and respect. Leonardo found that he genuinely liked the young French king. At Clos Luce, Leonardo experienced a kind of peaceful productivity that he had rarely known before. Leonardo had always dreamed of writing comprehensive books about painting, anatomy, engineering, and other subjects. During his time in France, Leonardo also continued to make new discoveries and inventions. The king often visited Leonardo at Clos Luce, sometimes bringing other members of the royal court to meet the famous master. But Leonardo's health was continuing to decline. The stroke he had suffered had weakened his right side. This awareness gave a sense of urgency to Leonardo's final years. Despite his physical limitations, Leonardo's mind remained sharp and active until near the end. As 1519 began, Leonardo da Vinci knew that his extraordinary life was approaching its end. The man who had spent 67 years pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and creativity could feel his strength leaving him day by day. But even as his body grew weaker, his mind remained as sharp and curious as ever. Leonardo spent his final months at Clos Luce surrounded by the people who cared about him most. His faithful student Francesco Melzi had followed him from Italy and never left his side. Melzi was more than just a student. He had become like a son to Leonardo, helping him with his daily needs and working tirelessly to organize the master's vast collection of notes and drawings. Also with Leonardo was his longtime companion Giacomo Salai, nicknamed Little Devil, who had been with him for nearly 30 years. Salai had come to Leonardo as a 10-year-old boy, wild and difficult to control. Over the years, he had grown into a handsome young man who served as both assistant and model for many of Leonardo's paintings. Despite Salai's reputation for being lazy and sometimes dishonest, Leonardo loved him deeply. The effects of his earlier stroke became more pronounced, and he found it increasingly difficult to move around. But his mind remained active, and he continued to work on organizing his papers and preparing his scientific observations for future generations. King Francis I continued to visit Leonardo regularly during these final months. He had filled thousands of pages with drawings and notes about anatomy, engineering, astronomy, botany, and countless other subjects. These notebooks contained discoveries that were centuries ahead of their time, but they were written in his peculiar mirror script and organized in ways that only he fully understood. Leonardo knew that this would be an enormous task, but he trusted Melzi more than anyone else to preserve his legacy. Every flower, every bird, every human face was a masterpiece of divine creation. His scientific studies had not weakened his faith but had actually strengthened it by showing him the incredible intricacy and perfection of the universe. He was 67 years old, which was considered very elderly in those days when most people died much younger. Later legends would claim that he died in the arms of King Francis I, but this romantic story was probably not true. Artists, scholars, and nobles who had known him or heard about his work mourned the loss of one of the greatest geniuses who had ever lived. Many people realized that an entire era was ending with Leonardo's death. He had been one of the last great figures of the High Renaissance, and his passing marked the close of one of the most creative periods in human history. The king was likely traveling on royal business at the time of Leonardo's death, but Leonardo saw it as a living work that could always be improved. Throughout his life, he had sometimes been viewed with suspicion by religious authorities because of his scientific investigations and his questioning approach to traditional teachings. But as death approached, Leonardo found peace in his own understanding of the divine. The Last Supper continued to attract visitors to Milan despite the damage it had already begun to suffer due to Leonardo's experimental painting technique. The Mona Lisa became the most famous painting in the world, though it would not become truly iconic until much later. King Francis I lost not just a court artist, but a friend and teacher who had opened his mind to new ways of thinking about art and science. Francesco Melzi had lost a father figure who had shaped his entire life. His contemporaries understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A single human being had excelled in painting, sculpture, architecture, engineering, anatomy, astronomy, botany, geology, and dozens of other fields. He had shown that art and science were not separate subjects but different ways of exploring the same fundamental truths about the universe. The household at Close Loose mourned a master who had brought excitement and wonder into their daily lives. Leonardo's notes were scattered across hundreds of separate sheets of paper. They began to realize that Leonardo's greatest achievement was not any single painting or invention. His masterpiece was the example he had set of what a human being could accomplish through curiosity, creativity, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations. The topics jumped from anatomy to engineering to philosophy without any clear organization. The mirror writing was hard to read, and many of the scientific concepts were too advanced for other scholars to understand. His death marked the end of an extraordinary life, but it also marked the beginning of a legend that would inspire countless future generations to push beyond the boundaries of what seemed possible. This perfectionism had frustrated many of his patrons over the years, but Francis understood that it was part of what made Leonardo's art so extraordinary. The young man was devastated by the loss of his beloved master, but he was determined to fulfill his promise to preserve Leonardo's legacy. Much of his knowledge remained hidden in private collections, waiting to be rediscovered by later generations who would finally be ready to understand his insights. Melzi spent the rest of his life trying to organize Leonardo's notebooks and prepare them for publication. The young king would sit for hours listening to the old master talk about his discoveries and inventions. He could no longer get out of bed, and his breathing became labored. Francesco Melzi and the other members of his household maintained a constant vigil by his bedside. King Francis, who was staying at the nearby castle of Amboise, visited as often as he could. Francis understood that he was in the presence of one of the greatest minds in human history, and he treasured every conversation they had together. Even after carrying it with him for more than 15 years, Leonardo still occasionally added tiny touches to the portrait. He would spend minutes studying Lisa's mysterious smile and then make almost invisible adjustments to the shadows around her eyes or the curve of her lips. During these visits, Leonardo would sometimes show the king his most precious painting, the Mona Lisa. The king marveled at Leonardo's dedication to perfection. Most artists would have considered the Mona Lisa finished years earlier. As spring arrived in 1519, Leonardo's health took a turn for the worse. Leonardo was deeply concerned about what would happen to his life's work after his death. Francesco Melzi promised his master that he would spend his life trying to organize these papers into books that other people could read and learn from. In his final weeks, Leonardo also spent time thinking about his spiritual beliefs. Leonardo believed that God could be seen in the beauty and complexity of the natural world. As April turned to May, Leonardo's condition became critical. On May 2, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died peacefully at Close-Louse. The news of Leonardo's death spread quickly throughout Europe. Francesco Melzi inherited most of Leonardo's papers and artworks. The task proved to be even more difficult than Melzi had expected. Despite Melzi's dedicated efforts, only a small portion of Leonardo's scientific work was published during the centuries immediately following his death. Leonardo's artistic legacy was more immediately apparent. His paintings, though few in number, were already recognized as masterpieces. The impact of Leonardo's death was felt most deeply by those who had known him personally. But even as people grieved for Leonardo the man, they began to recognize the magnitude of what he had accomplished. Leonardo had proven that the human mind was capable of understanding and creating far more than most people had ever imagined. In the days following his death, as his friends and admirers tried to come to terms with their loss, the boy from Vinci, who had been born a bastard and excluded from formal education, had become the most admired and respected man of his age. More than 500 years have passed since Leonardo da Vinci died in his bed at Close-Louse, but his influence on the world continues to grow stronger with each passing decade. The man who struggled during his lifetime to find people who understood his ideas has become a symbol of human genius that inspires millions of people around the globe. Francesco Melzi had tried his best to organize his master's notebooks, but the task was simply too enormous for one person to complete. When Melzi died in 1570, Leonardo's papers were scattered among different collectors and libraries across Europe. Art lovers admired the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, but they had no idea about the thousands of pages of scientific observations and engineering designs that gathered dust in private collections. In the centuries immediately following Leonardo's death, much of his scientific work remained hidden and forgotten. As they decoded his mirror writing and examined his drawings, they made discovery after discovery that amazed them. Here was a man who had designed helicopters 400 years before they were actually built. He had drawn submarines centuries before anyone sailed beneath the ocean. He had studied human anatomy with an accuracy that medical schools were just beginning to achieve. When the Wright brothers built their airplane in 1903, people remembered that Leonardo had studied flight and designed flying machines centuries earlier. When engineers began building helicopters and submarines, they found that Leonardo had already solved many of the basic problems they faced. His studies of the eye and vision were more accurate than anything produced until the invention of modern medical equipment. His observations about geology and the formation of mountains were centuries ahead of their time. His most important contribution to the world was his way of thinking. Leonardo showed that the best way to understand anything was to observe it carefully, ask questions about it, and experiment with it. When he painted the Mona Lisa, he used his knowledge of anatomy to make her face look real. When he designed flying machines, he made them beautiful as well as functional. The Mona Lisa is probably the most recognized image on Earth. People who have never been to art school and know nothing about painting still recognize her mysterious smile. The painting has been reproduced millions of times and has inspired countless books, movies, and songs. Engineers designing new aircraft study his drawings of bird flight and flying machines. Medical researchers use his anatomical studies to understand how the human body works. Robotics experts look at his mechanical designs for inspiration. When astronauts float weightless in space, they are fulfilling dreams that Leonardo first imagined when he watched birds soar through the sky above. Vinci, even computer programmers and video game designers find ideas in his notebooks. This combination of scientific accuracy and artistic beauty influenced countless artists and inventors who came after him. When one of his drawings goes up for sale, it can sell for hundreds of millions of dollars. Many of his greatest projects were never finished, and many of his ideas could not be built with the technology of his time. But he never stopped trying and he never stopped learning. Some of the most important learning comes from observing the world around us and asking questions about how things work. Leonardo's example encourages young people to be curious about everything and to never stop exploring. His methods of using light and shadow, his understanding of human psychology, and his attention to tiny details still influence how artists work today. His approach to studying anatomy, mechanics, and natural phenomena established methods that researchers still use today. This persistence in the face of obstacles has inspired countless people who face their own challenges and setbacks. Schools teach children about his life as an example of what human curiosity and creativity can accomplish. He lived at a time when most people accepted the limits that society placed on them. But Leonardo refused to accept any limits. He believed that with enough curiosity, creativity, and hard work, people could understand anything and create anything. In an age when people are often encouraged to specialize in narrow fields, Leonardo reminds us that the greatest discoveries come from seeing connections between different subjects. But Leonardo da Vinci achieved a kind of immortality that few human beings ever reach. He became more than just a person. He became a symbol of the unlimited potential of the human spirit. This approach, which we now call the scientific method, became the foundation of all modern science and technology. Leonardo's example reminds us that these challenges can be solved if we approach them with the same combination of artistic imagination and scientific rigor that he brought to his work. The inventors of the computer drew ideas from mathematics, electronics, and even art. The creators of the internet used concepts from engineering, psychology, and communication theory. Like Leonardo, they succeeded by refusing to stay within the boundaries of single subjects. They are curious about many things, creative in their thinking, and willing to cross the boundaries between different fields of knowledge. This is perhaps the greatest compliment we can pay to any human being, and it ensures that Leonardo's legacy will continue to inspire future generations for centuries to come. For almost 300 years, most people knew Leonardo only as a painter who had created a few famous masterpieces. This began to change in the 1800s when scholars finally started to study Leonardo's notebooks seriously. The more scholars learned about Leonardo's scientific work, the more they realized how far ahead of his time he had been. His notebooks contained ideas about flight, hydraulics, optics, geology, and biology that would not be fully understood by mainstream science until the 20th century. He became proof that human beings were capable of achieving far more than most people believed possible. His life showed that one person could excel in many different fields and that creativity and scientific thinking could work together to produce amazing results. As Leonardo's complete genius became known, he transformed from a famous artist into something much more important. During the 1900s, as technology finally caught up with some of Leonardo's ideas, his reputation grew even larger. Modern scientists studying Leonardo's anatomical drawings discovered that he had understood how the heart worked as a pump long before doctors accepted this idea. But Leonardo's greatest legacy is not any single discovery or invention. Leonardo also proved that art and science were not opposite ways of thinking but different tools for exploring the same truths. In our modern world, Leonardo has become more famous than ever before. Museums around the world compete to display Leonardo's works and notebooks. Leonardo's influence can be seen everywhere in modern technology. The space agency NASA has named missions and equipment after Leonardo, recognizing him as one of the pioneers of human flight. But perhaps the most important way that Leonardo influences our world today is through the example of his curiosity. Modern innovators who create new technologies often work the way Leonardo did, combining knowledge from many different fields. Leonardo's life also teaches us that failure and frustration are normal parts of the creative process. Students around the world study Leonardo's story to learn that education does not have to happen only in classrooms. Artists continue to study Leonardo's techniques and try to understand how he created such lifelike and emotionally powerful images. Scientists and engineers see Leonardo as one of their founding fathers. A person who showed that careful observation and systematic experimentation could unlock the secrets of the natural world. Perhaps most importantly, Leonardo da Vinci represents hope for what human beings can accomplish. This message is especially important in our modern world, where we face complex problems like climate change, disease, and poverty. The little boy who was born in Vinci over 500 years ago could never have imagined that his name would be known around the world or that his ideas would still be inspiring people centuries after his death. Today, when we say someone is a Renaissance person, we mean they are like Leonardo.